Guys, I think I've run into a problem. I may have come to a video on something so good, so excellent, so fiendishly brilliant, that it's impossible for me to come up with a coherent introduction. But this is my reaction to Spartacus, War of the Damned.
No words. No words.
Maybe it's because I'm extremely jaded about how most shows are renewed based on ratings rather than quality, and it's depressingly common for the final seasons to be extremely disappointing, even though I did like Charmed Season 8 and Buffy Season 7. But after having spent an entire year obsessing over Spartacus's fourth and final season, I'm even more amazed at just what a perfect ending it was to the whole series.
Name terms of surrender, and let us be done with this.
There are none I would trust a Roman to honor.
Thankfully, the higher-ups knew very early on that War of the Damned would be the end. Although Stephen DeKnight had originally envisioned 5 to 7, on researching the historical events during Spartacus's war against Marcus Crassus, it became clear that real life does not so easily fit the structure of a TV show. Spartacus's forces fought amongst themselves and then split up and got back together multiple times, travelling in all the compass points, and all the while umpteen Roman forces were sent after them only to get defeated. So the idea of stretching the factual stuff out across 2 or 3 more seasons without deviating too much from history did not seem appealing, and they knew before they'd finished writing Vengeance that War of the Damned would be the end of it. They debated about doing as little as 8 episodes to make the most of the budget, or 16 in 2 parts, before going with 10 as Vengeance had, describing it as cutting out the boring parts to give everyone 10 fantastic weeks of TV.
Bring end to slave rebellion and death of Spartacus.
War of the Damned takes place supposedly a year after the end of Vengeance, and enough time for both Crassus and Naevia to grow their hair out. Rome needs to fund their campaign against the rebels, and so they turn to the wealthy Marcus Crassus, who's keen to get the clout and titles necessary for political advancement, and beating Spartacus is the right way to achieve that.
And you possess wealth. Absent name.
Spartacus's forces also have to fear an approaching winter, so the first half of the season is about them conquering the city of Sinuessa for shelter, and the second about them fending for themselves in the wild, building towards an eventual separation led by Crassus that is then crushed by the forces of Crassus's oldest son Tiberius, and the remaining rebels prepare to face the Romans in one final battle.
When we again meet, I will kill you.
No. You're going to try.
There are also plenty of new faces, some of whom might be familiar.
Gaius, Julius Caesar.
Yep, this offers up a young Julius Caesar, being used as a mole to bring down the rebels from within. The last of Spartacus's historical generals, Castus, finally makes an appearance as part of a group of pirates who've been doing under-the-table deals with Sinuessa. It's also not a complete sausage fest, as we see the introduction of Laeta, a Sinuessa noblewoman who ends up an enemy of Rome, defecting to the rebels and becoming Spartacus's lover. More romance is in the air, as Gannicus finds himself in a love triangle between Saxa, who's finally learned the common tongue, and an extremely religious slave girl he liberates called Sibyl.
You feel you owe debt, Sibyl.
Crassus himself is not ignored in the love department either, as he's revealed to be in a loveless marriage to his wife Tertula, because his heart belongs to his slave Kore, and the relationship gets very complicated thanks to his own actions towards the aforementioned Tiberius, who also gets several lingering looks with another boy he grew up with called Sabinus, meaning they're such good friends.
I will not have you from my side in this, Sabinus. The gods themselves could not wrest me from it.
So that makes 6 queer characters. 7 if you include Belessa, this gal Saxa hooks up with, and it looks like Sibyl isn't completely against a threesome, and 4 of them survive. This is better representation than the L word. And before I get into the characters, I have to say that the powers that be weren't kidding when they said cut out the boring parts to give 10 great episodes, and there is not a single one in this season that either runs over long or too short. While we would have loved the proposed 90-minute finale, the 1 hour we get is still near flawless. And the pacing, as depressing as it is to compare Spartacus to Game of Thrones, I consider the best seasons of that to be 3 and 4, and even those still fall into issues with extraneous scenes put in there to pad the runtime that do very little for the overall narrative, such as the repetitive scenes of Theon's torture, Tyrion's pointless monologue about Orson Lannister, or the weird comedy bit about Podrick's prowess with the women. And even compared to current shows that I love, like Yellow Jackets, as well as numerous Disney Plus series that didn't have an active showrunner, the pacing of Spartacus War of the Damned is like the freshest breath of air. Only 5 episodes are spent in Sinuessa, and one of those is about infiltrating the city, and yet the material feels so well covered I have to remind myself it didn't make up the entire season. The story unfolds so fast, and yet it doesn't feel rushed. Not a single plot point feels underdeveloped. No character feels wasted. There are arcs that unfold very fast, but again, I have no answer on how you could slow them down and still have them work as well. This season knew where the story was going and exactly how to get there. And while when I read that there was talk of this being a 16-episode season, the thought of getting more of this was intriguing to me, I have to say that it probably would have lost what made it so strong if there were 6 additional episodes of filler or padding. Blood and Sand benefited from having 13 because it was introducing us to this world and setting things up. War of the Damned is wrapping things up and setting the stage for a spectacular conclusion. While Blood and Sand is a masterclass in setup and payoff, War of the Damned is one in how to make a finale matter. And not just the finale victory. Episode 2, Wolves at the Gate, involving the infiltration and conquering of Sinuessa, is almost as epic as Kill Them All, and practically a mini-movie on its own. Episode 6, Spoils of War, is a relatively simple alternate POV story involving Gannicus and Sibyl trying to escape Sinuessa, and it is one of the best directed episodes of the series, with a near-perfect blend between the excitement one wants from an action show and these intimate character moments that enhance our enjoyment of the spectacle.
I begin to believe in your gods. Let us see how far they will take us.
And this season goes to some very dark, bleak places in a way that Spartacus was able to where other shows couldn't, in that it felt in service of something, as opposed to simply there to shock or be edgy, like the horrifying torture of an innocent Roman woman by Nemetes and his gang, which is kept off-screen to allow our mind to fill in the blanks, and is in service of a huge rift between the rebels that is key in the Romans being able to retake the city. It is insane how well this season blends shocking plot twists, character development, smart political drama, and exciting action scenes without ever feeling like substance got shortchanged for style. Stephen DeKnight said they would prefer to go out on a high note rather than drag it out for quantity over quality, and they made the right call. This season feels like a real last hurrah, not just for the characters, but the world itself, reminding you of everything that made the show so good, and giving you the chance to have one last good time before bidding farewell. But it wasn't just saying goodbye to old favourites, because there were plenty of new faces that made the season as strong as it was. And it's hard to know who to start with, so ladies first. Now, I remember getting very excited when I heard that Anna Hutchison would be joining the cast. I'd only seen her in The Cabin in the Woods, and she's only in that film for about 40 minutes, but the screen absolutely comes alive whenever she's on it. And watching that alongside Spartacus just confirms her range.
Hurry up with the very fabulous. I'm getting insecure about it now.
Hold sentiment until it is deserved. I do not expect him to be moved.
I wonder if the writers also shared my thoughts on how I felt Ilithia should have developed at the end of Vengeance and decided to create a new character to explore that direction, because Laeta feels like almost exactly what I expected of Ilithia, though not to the extent of becoming Spartacus's lover. She's a privileged Roman noble when we meet her, though she's much more humane than any of the others we meet, and her situation mirrors Spartacus's, where she loses everything in an instant, all because of a war that's outside her control. You really feel for this woman, who was an otherwise good person in spite of being a slave owner, and then sees hundreds of people killed in front of her, including her own husband, and then later finds out he was trading with pirates behind her back.
Know that I do not take pleasure in staining cherished memory.
You tear word from grasp and whisper of kindness.
And one thing I like about Laeta's story is that neither she nor Spartacus are presented as morally superior. Spartacus did take over her city, and a lot of people were killed because of it, but he is fighting a war to end slavery. Laeta may be a slave owner, but she's still a human being trying to survive in an impossible situation she's been thrust into, and there are some really interesting touches, such as hiding a group of people under her stables to protect them from the more bloodthirsty rebels, and cutting deals with Spartacus to ensure the safety of her people.
You will lend a hand in seeing your people receive proper share of food. Carry word to me if any should fall to mistreatment.
One thing this show did very well by its female characters was in offering up a whole variety of ways in which they could be characters. Once Upon a Time fell headlong into the trap of making every woman a feisty warrior or magic user in the name of pop feminist empowerment, and Game of Thrones had a tendency to motivate the women by spite. Spartacus allowed some of the female characters to take up the sword and become action girls like Mira and Naevia, and then pre-existing warriors like Saxa. We already had those types of strong female characters, and so Laeta serves as a demonstration of a different kind of strength.
You gave aid to the man that robbed you of husband's life in order to save your own.
To save as many of my people that yet drew breath. Thing I would do again if so needed.
In being robbed of everything, she still finds ways to help other people and show that she is a good person at heart. Unlike Naevia, who became a monster no better than her enemies because she let her trauma define her. One of the most harrowing moments for Laeta's character is when she learns that Crassus has sold her to Heraclio to be his slave, and receives an especially nasty brand to her arm. And it is that which allows her to understand just what Spartacus and the rest of the rebels have experienced. And while she ends up among their camp not entirely by choice, it's that understanding that allows her to properly become one of them.
Your wound gives pain.
It reminds that I yet live. And choose to continue to do so.
Laeta's perspective is a big part of what makes the season's storyline so interesting, and Anna Hutchison lights up the screen as expected. She and Liam McIntyre have some nice chemistry, and you can telegraph Spartacus and Laeta getting together from their very first scene.
You stand well supplied.
Shipment received this day from Sicilia.
The feelings unfold fast, but make sense in the context of what their situation is. Not necessarily love, but mutual respect, and needing each other at that moment in time. Spartacus as his inevitable death draws closer, and Laeta as she transitions from privileged noblewoman to fugitive peasant.
It is not your heart I'm after this night.
It's very important that she be one of the few characters to survive the series as well. Laeta is a great addition to the main cast, and Anna Hutchison is on her A-game every second she's on screen.
Embrace what you have. All can change in a sudden moment.
She is one of 3 great female characters introduced here, and number 2 is... Sibyl first shows up in episode 2, among many slaves chained up to watch as another gets stoned to death for speaking about Spartacus. Then getting a meet-cute with Gannicus after he stabs her Dominus to death when he was about to kill her for trying to fight back after he killed her best friend. It's less confusing than it sounds. Anyway, Sibyl has turned to her faith as a coping mechanism for what's implied to be a pretty tough life, and she considers Gannicus someone sent by the gods to save them, which he thinks is cute but rather naive.
I do not ask you believe it to be true, only to accept that it is what I hold to heart.
On being forced together as Crassus's forces retake the city, he sees her in a new light, and eventually falls in love with her, making her the first woman he's caught actual feelings for since Melita, and his statements that he shall wait for her in the afterlife with Melita and Enemeus indicates that he views her as his one true love.
I have warned you to stay far from men of my kind.
You ask the impossible.
Now, if I made an hour-long video defending the original Disney princesses, you bet I am going to declare my love for Sibyl as a character and go to my grave defending her romance with Gannicus. In fact, my friend Sarah, who played Sibyl in this recreation of a scene with me... Would that it had made difference?
You've made all the world.
Described her as a Disney princess in the middle of a Spartacus story. She's definitely a combination of Snow White and Cinderella, and I'm all for it. This is the kind of character you need in a show like Spartacus to prevent things from getting too bleak, especially if you're going to kill off the other cute characters like Pietros and Diona.
You are safe. You are safe.
And I see people wondering how on earth Gannicus could leave Saxa for her, so let me break it down. Gannicus is a character full of self-loathing, from how he fell for his best friend's wife and betrayed the Brotherhood, to thinking all he was worth was glory in the arena, which is why he's so depressed years after being freed, spending all his time drinking and paying for women's company. Saxa didn't challenge his sense of self. What they had was very casual, and while they obviously cared about each other and respected the other as comrades, Gannicus clearly didn't hold her in high regard the way he did Melita. But as much as he declares that he's...
I am for wine and the embrace of questionable women.
He is so much more than that. He betrayed Rome because he saw how innocent people were getting hurt in the crossfire of Spartacus's war, and eventually joined him to honor his best friend. And he had previously given up his champion status so that he would be traded to another Dominus, and therefore not ruin Ananias and Melita's marriage. Gannicus was a man of honor, and much better than he gave himself credit for. Sibyl knows nothing about his past, and all she sees is the man who saved her life and liberated her. Sibyl's presence challenges him to see himself in a different light, and comprehend all the good he's done and why he did it.
Would that it had made a difference?
You have made all in the world.
He initially turns her down because he believes himself to be a shallow womanizer, and her to be a naive idiot who will just get her heart broken if she goes after obviously bad guys. But when they're hiding under the stables, he sees that Sibyl's attitude towards life isn't naivety, but its own form of strength.
Before you came to the city, I prayed to the gods that they would deliver me from the hands of my dominus.
She chose to adopt a positive outlook, trusting in her faith to get her through the difficult times, and she does not take a single good thing for granted. And in that moment, Gannicus realizes how wise she actually is, and internally goes that if a girl of this level of wisdom and maturity thinks I'm a good person, then perhaps I am after all. And I actually like that she's defined by being kind and hopeful, because the show was sorely lacking in that kind of energy after Naevia's personality switch. She doesn't need to be a fighter, because she represents the type of people Gannicus is fighting for, the ones who can't defend themselves, but who are just as worthy of freedom.
We are alive, because they yet guide your hand. One I have faith will see us from darkest hour.
Sibyl is far from useless. She's the personification of the term soft power. Quoting Starlight,
"Since when did hopeful and naive become the same thing?"
And Gwendolyn Taylor is really nice in the role, managing the right balance between that must-protect-at-all-costs cuteness and optimistic wisdom without being cloying.
You struck down the man that took his life. The man that took my own, small piece at a time over a span of years.
So Sibyl is a great addition to the show, and the perfect choice for Gannicus to finally experience true love with. How crazy is it that on a show about gladiators and horrible people backstabbing each other, one of my favourite characters is this gal? But another runner-up for my favourite is also a newbie this season. Whenever I rewatch War of the Damned, it's usually by the second episode that I really can't get over just how great a character Corey is.
I know your concern for the boy.
He no longer stands as such, but in the eyes of his father.
Introduced seemingly as a particularly high-ranking slave in Marcus Crassus' house, who is treated extremely well by himself and his son Tiberius, the first big twist in her storyline is that Crassus is actually in love with her, and the feeling is more than mutual, taking the subtext from the movie between Crassus and his slave Antoninus and making it text.
Yes. It is something I desire. Marcus.
We got hints of the idea that some slaves may have preferred the position they had previously had with Naevia's introduction, but we see it fully here that Corey is pretty happy with her lot in life. She has a master who genuinely loves her and wants to hear her honest thoughts on things, and she's a second mother to his son. And when Crassus retakes Sinuessa, his plan for her was that she would become the Vilica of his villa in the city, which would be a huge promotion. The only problem...
He took something from me. I would have something in return.
While it was foreshadowed when Caesar ironically made a move on her, Corey gets the illusion shattered completely in a horrifying scene where the boy she helped raise and cared for like he was her family uses her to get revenge on his father, reminding her of her powerlessness as a slave. And the conflict for her is wondering whether Crassus truly loves her enough to take her word over his son's. And it's extremely likely that the possibility of getting that ultimate heartbreak and rejection when she needs reassurance most is too overpowering for her to even risk it. So she defects and joins Spartacus's forces, but in a rather sweet moment that shows she has not let the horrible things that happened to her turn her into a horrible person, hint hint, we next see her helping one of the now free slaves delivering a baby. It's also an interesting character point that she never thought to hide her brand because, as a slave who was treated well in her household, she's not used to sneaking around or being duplicitous. But of course, Corey's big moment this season comes when Tiberius is among those captured Romans forced to fight to the death, which actually happened in history.
You were never placed in chains.
You forged them with your own hands.
Although Tiberius tries to manipulate her with tales of Crassus still loving her, she trolls him and leaves him to his fate. But when he looks like he'll escape consequences as part of a trade to free 500 prisoners of war, Quarre stabs him in the back to get justice for what he did to her, and then offers herself as a replacement trade.
Crassus will yet honor trade, if you give him something else his heart desires.
Caesar, who had no love for Tiberius either, honors this agreement, and so Quarre basically scores the ultimate checkmate of killing off the hated villain and still ensuring the survival of 500 people anyway. And this moment isn't without its own sacrifice, since at first she hides what Tiberius did to her to preserve Crassus's image of his son, even though it means she's put in chains and treated like a common slave.
His love for you turned to hate in the wake of the decimation, and he struck at you the only way he could.
And even when the truth comes out and Crassus forgives her, the fact that she was known to be of the rebellion and there were witnesses to her killing Tiberius means that this is her fate.
It is hard sight to see one so loved among the damned.
A harrowing end, but it's been pointed out that if Crassus didn't make an example of her, she'd have likely been punished by the Senate and reduced to the same fate as Naevia, so it was crucifixion or torture and eventual death in the mines. The optimist in me wishes that she could have survived and her and Crassus's love story could have endured, but unfortunately, Crassus is the type of guy who gives up the glory for the sake of political advancement, and therefore is not the one who would risk everything for love. And I doubt you'll be surprised when I say that Jenna Lind is great in this role.
I stand no soldier in this conflict.
Quarre calls for a lot of softness and ingenue aspects like what Leslie Ann Brandt brought to Naevia, but she's meant to be a little older and more maternal, with a bit more world wisdom, as well as being able to buy that this gal would take up a dagger and kill someone if she had to, and she accomplished all of that.
Do you know what you have done?
I have balanced scale.
Fun fact, she was also friends with Jai Courtney and Viva Bianca, and watched Blood and Sand to support them, so she was already a fan when she got her audition as Quarre, and then she ends up playing one of the best characters on the show. Now there's an arc. But I have to segue to the one thing that keeps War of the Damned from being a perfect season, and talk about the worst character on the show. Or on days when I'm especially bitter, the one I consider the real villain. I already touched on this in my video on Vengeance, but I don't think anyone on screen has ever provoked the same levels of hate in my adult self beyond Janice from Mean Girls, and she at least gets some fun lines, or else Chris from the show that was Black Christmas 2019, but everyone is terrible in that masterpiece.
You never stop, do you? You just I don't stop because they don't stop!
And I fully admit that I'm comfortably sitting here after umpteen rewatches with the benefit of hindsight, and I wasn't writing by contract for a deadline. And when I have in the past, I've often created things I wasn't 100% happy with, so there is that to be in consideration of. I'm not sure exactly what was behind this decision, whether it started with the recasting and they just rewrote Naevia to be more in line with Cynthia Addai-Robinson's take on the character, or they wanted to beef up her action girl credentials after killing off Mira, or the idea was to show what trauma does to a person, but I don't think any of those decisions fit this particular character.
Not all of us can be strong.
Sometimes I think that it might have been better to just kill Naevia off screen and have Crixus fall for another woman, because the character has become unrecognizable.
Full to fucking games now.
The Romans forced you and Crixus to such for their amusement.
Naevia, as played by Leslie Ann Brandt, is the type of gal who would get on very well with Sibyl. Naevia A looked after Pietrus's birds in remembrance, knowing that she couldn't tell him about Barca and had to let him believe his lover abandoned him. She tried to be there for Diona, and even arranged for her to escape in the hopes that it would alleviate her trauma.
By passage far from Capua, and the things that have been done to you.
Naevia B forces an innocent Roman to fight to the death for bread to feed his pregnant wife, and then she slices his fingers off because she decided he was going to attack Crixus. I knew he was going to attack me. Where have we heard that one before? And speaking from way too many personal experiences, here's a PSA to everyone watching. If you're calling someone on bad behavior and they have a never before mentioned sob story at the ready to distract you, designed to make you feel guilty for having a problem with said bad behavior, that's a textbook example of emotional manipulation. And she still tries to dodge consequences for murdering Attius with this complete non-apology.
Though he forced my hand, I know now he did not deserve such fate.
Not to mention that they were trying to raise their numbers and she murdered the only blacksmith they had who needed to make weapons. So, toxic AF and dumb as a bag of hammers. I recently held a poll on who TV's most toxic woman is. Merlin won easily among the men, And Naevia almost won out until I watched season 4 of The Boys, and hello narcissist hypocrite. See you next Tuesday, Annie. And with Naevia, this all feels very intentional, since she's continually put on the moral high ground against Gannicus, and it makes her repeated comeuppance quite satisfying.
Attius was a Roman. You felt to deserve a fate.
He was my friend, you mad bitch!
She's even given a very ignoble death, as opposed to Saxa getting to take her killer with her. And if there's a silver lining, the character finally gets a noble moment in the penultimate episode, The Dead and the Dying, where she gets the chance to fight Tiberius to the death in gladiator games, intending to make him pay for killing Crassus, and she's then told that Crassus is offering to return 500 prisoners of war if they let him have Tiberius back. The decision is left to her, and she gives up her revenge to save the 500, which also allows for Agron and Naevia to be reunited. It does not erase everything, but it is something. But now for an actual villain in the series. Here is a character I did not expect to be so compelling when I first watched the season, and I most certainly did not telegraph what direction he'd go in. We'd touched on the idea that people who'd be considered children by today's standards would be considered adults by Roman ones, such as Numerius and Seppius and Seppia, and since our brains are still going through adolescence until we get to the age of 25 or so, it adds some interesting themes about people being expected to be adults before they actually are mentally. And this season goes there with what being a child soldier might have been like in the Roman army, especially if your own father is the Imperator.
I am not your father in this, I am your f***ing Imperator!
Tiberius is based on Marcus Crassus's older son, also called Marcus, but renamed presumably to avoid confusion and because his historical counterpart didn't participate in the war. He's introduced as a genuinely decent, if not outright good, moral person who views Cora in high enough regard that he comforts her after seeing her distress that Caesar made advances on her, but he's also very ambitious and doesn't want to be seen as a child. So he tries to earn his father's respect. He tries to do so by disobeying his commands and launching an attack on Spartacus when he leaves the city, but his heart was in the right place. And what makes Tiberius even more tragic in some ways is that he holds his ground, and so does Sabinus. But the men themselves run, and in trying to punish them, Crassus just punishes those who did the right thing. And the decimation is something the Roman army historically did, which Crassus revived during the Third Servile War, and he did indeed use it to punish soldiers who had broken ranks during combat and fled from the rebel army. This specific instance saw a cohort of 500 men selected from the survivors, divided into groups of 10, and the one who'd be clubbed or stoned to death selected by lot. Spartacus plays this for maximum drama, where Sabinus draws the lot, right after Tiberius had tried to get him excused because he did nothing wrong, and Sabinus insisted on taking part so as not to affect his standing even further.
I will talk to my father and beg your removal from decimation. The act would only diminish you in his eyes. A thing I would never allow.
And Tiberius is forced to not only watch his childhood friend die as a result of his own actions, but also beat him to death on his father's orders. And I say childhood friend because Christian Antidormi insisted there was no romantic relationship between Tiberius and Sabinus. And as fun as it is to shoot down some of the more extreme slashers, this is one for which I'm fully like, yep, totally there.
It Caesar's heart to know you in such pain.
Aaron Jakubenko spends most of his screen time staring dreamily at Christian Antidormi, and there's a lot of held gazes between them and exchanges that make it clear these two care for each other a lot.
Must retreat! No! I will not see you fall!
And I personally like the ambiguity, because in the historical context, they would never be able to act on their feelings. It's different for the nobles taking slaves of the same gender as lovers, because they were already considered lesser, and Tiberius and Sabinus entering into a relationship where the family's position is already tenuous because Crassus's money without the name attached to it would not help. So the death of Sabinus here isn't just traumatic because of how horrifying it is in general, but because it also means that Tiberius has to destroy a fundamental part of himself in order to succeed in this world.
You shall do as commanded. As all soldiers must.
And he knows that his father is having things both ways by carrying on an affair with his slave that's an open secret in their house. And he throws away any sympathy by taking revenge on the completely innocent Cora in a way that feels 100% organic to the character. They literally built to a heel turn in 2 episodes, just like Daenerys in Game of Thrones, and it was infinitely more believable. But to be fair, it was a character introduced only that season. I mentioned Titanic a lot for a specific scene, and I like to call this the iceberg effect. where there is a built-up tension to something that will shift the story massively, and even once you know what's going to happen, on the second watch, you still find yourself wishing what you know will happen won't, because it was built to so well. For me, the iceberg effect happens in episode 5, where I find myself praying that Tiberius won't go down this path and hold on to his goodness. And this scene is so harrowing, especially because of how much I love Kore as a character, that using her like this feels like the ultimate betrayal. It is horrifying and effective at the same time.
No. Mistake mine.
And then Tiberius slots into the Joffrey Baratheon or / Ramsay Bolton role of being an absolute see you next Tuesday who exists to be hated, and succeeds where Ramsay failed by not overstaying his welcome, and the plot not contriving ways to keep him in the game, his luck running out before the audience's patience does. It is insane how in episode 4 I am feeling so bad for this character for having to execute his best friend, but by episode 9 I am relishing in how karma rains down on him and he gets a glorious comeuppance because of it.
Know that I shall return at nightfall, when it is your time to die. A thing I long to lay eyes upon.
With War of the Damned by necessity having sympathetic villains like Crassus and Caesar, we did need to have that one prominent baddie made to be hated, and Tiberius filled that role nicely. No notes at all.
With sword of steel, in a war he began with but tongue of silver.
Christian Antidormi has a way of playing down the pompous arrogance in a way that Ewan Rowan didn't, which is what made Ramsay Bolton so exhausting. He's even got the passive aggression and cattiness down in a way that would make Ilithia applaud.
The Imperator would see us to common ground. I find us far removed.
It's not a performance that's going to light the world on fire, but he does a good job and filled his role nicely.
You choose your words with care, as all who must, in such position.
But of course, we know who did light the world on fire. I have to admit, I was very surprised when I found out Julius Caesar was going to be a character in this season, mostly because I'm used to depictions of him focusing mainly on meeting Cleopatra and getting assassinated, making him feel like he's the Roman Morgan Freeman and just sprang into existence already as an older man. And while the idea of having him in the show seems like a step in the Tarantino alternate history direction, it isn't completely known exactly what he was doing during the Third Servile War, and he did have a strong connection to Marcus Crassus, so it's not implausible that he would be involved in the fight against Spartacus, and that's all I need to stand by this decision.
She never did care for me.
Have you ever given her reason?
Well, apologies for not worshipping her as Juno upon cloud.
Todd Lasance is so good in this role. There was talk of a spin-off centered around young Caesar, and the thought of how good he would have been in that.
I require no lesson in my f***ing heritage.
But we do get 9 episodes of him playing, well, I stand by this meme I made last year. Caesar is also the kind of addition War of the Damned needs to avoid feeling too bleak, since everyone knows it's going to end with the main character and most of his forces being defeated, so having a character we like among the side that's going to do that helps cushion the blow.
You forever speak of the future.
Caesar is the fun kind of anti-villain who doesn't have a sob story to explain why he's a villain, but still has a moral code and standards that make him compelling, like Tywin Lannister's soft spot for children, or how Quintus and Lucretia legitimately loved and cared for each other. Caesar may be introduced as a hot-tempered loose cannon who makes advances on a woman who merely serves him a drink, but once he realizes Crassus has a thing for Kore, he's like, my bad, bro. And even then, Caesar is pretty respectful towards women.
You are taken with wife.
He does cheat on his wife multiple times, but he's genuinely horrified at what Nemetes has done to the captured Fabia, and actually goes out of his way to help Kore get justice for what Tiberius did to her, and not just because it aligns with his goals. He's also opposed to the idea of selling Laeta into slavery, and furious at the callous murder of one of his ladies, which further motivates him into looking the other way so Tiberius can get his just desserts. Sometimes you get the impression that we'd be considering Caesar an outright hero if he were fighting for the rebels, which undoubtedly was done with an eye on a potential spin-off where we would be expected to root for him outright.
We did not wish to cause you further pain absent reason, Marcus.
There's even enough ambiguity in his performance to encourage my headcanon that he was actually in love with Kore himself. But even as a villain, his initial role of going undercover as a mole to encourage disharmony in the rebels is just chef's kiss. I don't know what else I can say about Caesar because the writing and overall performance is honestly perfect.
Cut circle with straightest line and give voice to what you would have of me.
Although, fun fact, episode 9 dramatizes a historical event where Spartacus held gladiator games in honor of the recently slain Crassus, but in reality, and the initial script, he made the captured Romans fight each other, and in this treatment it would have been Caesar and Tiberius in a fight to the death, which would have been epic, but they went with the rebels fighting the Romans themselves so as not to have the main characters spend the penultimate episode sitting around watching other people fight, which is fair, and what resulted is obviously better from a storytelling point of view. Moving on. Now, as someone who saw Vengeance before Gods of the Arena, it took me a while to really get Gannicus as a character, because when you see his development out of order, you're obviously not seeing the full journey. But now that I'm all caught up, War of the Damned is the season that makes Gannicus a really great character.
We fought, we won. Does that cover neither ground?
He was fun in Gods of the Arena, somewhat interesting in Vengeance, and the two are merged in War of the Damned with an arc that's really quite heartwarming if you break it down. Gannicus is one character who is actually doing quite alright when the season starts, having gotten forgiveness from Enemeus and closure over Melita's death, as well as an outlet for his talent of being an unstoppable killing machine where he's not a slave. He's as close to how he used to be when we first met him. But comfort isn't the same as happiness, because as I said earlier, Gannicus isn't the womanizing frat boy he seems to think he is. I mean, we never saw him doing a Barney Stinson and seducing a naive young woman to have fun and later drop when he got tired of her. He's actually pretty good at staying committed to one woman, and Spartacus also has to play the proverbial angel on the shoulder, gently reminding him of his worth.
I would have you stand more than just another sword.
This season shows that Gannicus isn't the dumb muscle or the heavy, which might more accurately describe Crassus. And while he's not the voice of reason like Agron, he's the X-factor they need to pull off some of their more impossible plans, like sneaking inside Sinuessa to bring it down from within with only 2 men, or staying behind to cause a distraction that'll help everyone else escape. Later also managing to flee the occupied city with 2 civilians against all odds. Even when they're trapped underneath the stables, he comes up with a mad plan to have Sibyl be the bait so that he can take out an entire group of Romans single-handedly. He is the personification of the phrase, crazy enough to work, and he is the kind of crazy you need to pull this sort of thing off. And while some might call his arc after Gods of the Arena one of redemption, I'd consider it more one of self-discovery, coming to eventual self-acceptance.
I give life to your cause in honor of Enemeus. I may even believe in it myself upon a day, but I am no leader.
He drinks constantly and goes around with an unchallenging woman like Saxa because it prevents him from getting vulnerable about his inner fears that he really does ruin everything he touches. He hates hearing Sibyl refer to him as a hero because he genuinely doesn't believe himself to be, and tells her to stay away from him because he's afraid of ruining someone he views as pure and good and therefore the opposite of him. But we see how he is honorable and heroic by being devoted to getting her out of Sinuessa, even risking his life to also save Laeta from the pirates, and spending all this time forced together with a young woman who thinks the world of him allows for some positive self-esteem that he's been sorely lacking, since while his comrades care for him, they see him as a fighter who helps contribute to their cause. But through Sibyl's eyes, he can see the difference he's actually making, and he likes it. Doing good and being good feels good to him, and he falls in love with a woman who helped him discover that about himself. And Sibyl doesn't become his life coach or anything, and he comes to these conclusions mostly on his own.
Gods themselves must have taken note of delivered prayer.
After Spartacus, Gannicus is arguably the most honorable person among the rebels. He can't even continue his fling with Saxa when he realizes he's catching feelings for another woman, and this selflessness merges itself with his loose cannon nature in battles, because as much as he says,
"I'm no martyr upon cross,"
he is the one willing to do the crazy thing that has a chance of working if it means helping other people. And ironically, even when this means he finds his one true love, he can't simply not fight in battle and stay with Sibyl for a peaceful peasant life, because he has to fight for the others who can't fight for themselves.
I would gladly give my life so that those more deserving may live.
The happy ending to his arc is an acceptance that he has come to believe in Spartacus's cause and is willing to lay his life on the line for it. The others fight for revenge, or simply in the hopes of going down fighting rather than be enslaved again, but Spartacus himself admits that he is now fighting to ensure that the innocent get to safety and have their chance at free lives, with Gannicus being the one who openly agrees to this. And Gannicus finally accepts a leadership position, choosing to have faith in the fact that Spartacus and Sibyl have faith in him. And while he's on the losing side, it means something that he isn't killed in battle, and it's Gannicus who's given the crucifixion death. Painful, yes, but in fiction, reserved for the noblest characters. Gannicus was a free man who ended up drawn into the war by circumstance, and had opportunities to turn away from it without consequence. But he ended up laying down his life for other people and sacrificed the most of any of the rebels. Gannicus was quite literally a hero, and his final moments celebrate him as such. And yes, him being the one to give Naevia a good talking to is a big help.
You are a true warrior now, Naevia. Lay hand upon me again for whatever reason, and I will treat you as one.
But before we get into the main villain, there are some other players that could use a bit of a nod. Poor Crassus doesn't get his own section this time, but arguably that is a good thing, because that means there are less problems with his arc than in Vengeance. Although, unfortunately, Naevia's addiction to being a diabolically awful human being means he gets dragged down with her in parts.
Knowing you are at my side gives comfort enough.
I will always stand so.
Although at least with Crassus there is a precedent for him being opposed to Spartacus, and not just with how they started out as rivals. Crassus historically did split from Spartacus with about 30,000 people, and the show neatly finds a way to incorporate both theories as to why. The first is that this was part of a plan between them, and the first half of the season has Spartacus working the boys, as we say in pro wrestling, to make the Romans think there's dissension in the ranks. The second is that Crassus wanted to eventually march on Rome, which is his actual reason for the split in the show. It also solves the problem Vengeance Crassus had of being a two-dimensional satellite character who was only about Naevia. Now he has his own motivations once again, and they tie into how becoming a gladiator for him was a major lifestyle upgrade, and now that they're at war, he's not a strategist, he's a fighter, and prefers the idea of a glorious death and going down fighting to waiting around or fleeing. Whereas Spartacus, as someone who lived an entire life as a free man, would rather the slaves he freed get to actually experience the same.
Few among us stand as gladiators. They do not pray for a glorious death. No, they pray to be led.
And of course, Crassus was not someone who rose through the ranks to earn his spot. He got given it because Gannicus threw a match. Meaning Crassus never had the humility that it takes to be anything but the main character in his own story. And although he and Spartacus do actually come to blows, they part on a rather sweet note, calling back to this conversation.
You know that in another life, you and I may have been as brothers.
You're not in this one.
Know that I was wrong. I will always hold you as such.
And while Crassus's exploits could have made for a mini-season in their own right, the show gives us just enough to feel satisfied, and without feeling the potential got squandered. And when you realize that episode 8 is going to be his swan song, this character got a very good send-off, and then an episode all about mourning and celebrating him. Agron also became a character I quite loved during this season, and not just because he's got his best haircut, but as much as he's heavily involved in the plot, his defining moment is this.
Seek him upon deck of his ship. The man...
He is a voice of reason among the madness that grips Crassus and the deranged psycho he's inexplicably still in love with, by becoming Spartacus's second in command and the one he can rely on, flipping the dynamic quite interestingly from Vengeance, where Agron was the one we wouldn't be in a rush to trust. And then, funnily enough, once out of Sinuessa and the Blizzard, he actually splits from Spartacus and follows Crassus. He was slated to die by crucifixion either in episode 9 or the finale, but Stephen DeKnight had already decided that him and Naevia would make it to the end, but because crucifying him non-fatally was still a cool idea, that's what we get. And as the only main character to survive a crucifixion, that leaves him unable to hold a sword as he used to, but he still finds a way to be part of the battle, and he gets the last line of the series.
Yet you shall always be remembered in the hearts of all who yearn for freedom.
Dan Furigel often gets left out of the discussions when talking about the strong performances in the series, but War of the Damned shows some of his best work.
God return you to my arms.
His fault to ever leave.
Naevia is part of a love triangle storyline that I'm not exactly wild about, since Agron is made out to be very unreasonable for having a problem with Castus openly making advances, but it doesn't bloat the runtime.
Hollow that once bound my neck is but distant memory. Do not think I will slip it round again for you!
Nemetes gets a slightly expanded role in the first half of the season, expanding on the idea of him being the token evil teammate we saw at the end of Vengeance, where he plots against Spartacus and shows that not everyone in the rebel army is a good person. And I have to say, Ditch Davy is very good at being creepy and off-putting.
You would turn against your people. These are not my people.
And hey, he got to play Caesar himself about 5 years later. There's also a rambunctious pirate called Heraclio who makes a heel turn to become an antagonist for episode 6, where he meets his end via a red-hot poker through the throat, courtesy of Laeta, minutes after he used it to brand her. I have to frequently remind myself that this is a character played by an actor and not a real person they just happened to find wandering about and just filmed his every move.
Then I call you f***ing brother!
Although he actually was real in the sense that Spartacus did get betrayed by pirates, and Heraclio was the name of an actual pirate who was at large during the Third Servile War. I keep forgetting that Attius the Blacksmith was only in a couple of episodes because there is material that feels extremely well covered, and he's really fleshed out for a character whose main purpose was to allow the rebels to take Sinuessa. And yes, getting to call Naevia out gets him bonus points.
He was reaching for the food, you mad!
Saxa continues to be wildly entertaining, as does Lugo, and Donar gets to have a nice death in the limelight, where he pretty much has Caesar beaten in a fair fight and chooses to go out on his own terms rather than be tortured by the Romans. And Heath Jones has probably got the most impressive physique in the series, second only to Peter Mensa. Sabinus deserves a mention because there isn't a lot to him and he's only in 4 episodes, but Aaron Jakubenko puts a lot in. And it isn't easy to portray another character's morality teller, and someone who's pure without being cute if you're a male actor, and I think the only other example that comes to mind is Shane Taylor as Doc Rowe in Band of Brothers. But he does a nice job, and the decimation scene stuck with me for days afterwards because of it.
And pray I draw well.
Even Turtula is only in 2 episodes and has very little to her, but they differ from what we saw in Ilithia, Lucretia and Sepia in terms of spoiled noblewomen. While she's obviously no saint and is quite mean to our girl Kore, you still can't help feeling for her, that she's trying to be a good wife and put more into her marriage, and her husband isn't outright cruel, but he obviously doesn't love her, and she just has to live with it.
Now I fear he favours another.
Then you stand as your mother.
But I guess I can't dodge a section on our main villain any longer. The most famous Roman in history not named Julius Caesar, remembered both for his part in turning the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire, and for being the man in command when Spartacus was finally defeated. So as the final boss of any story about the Third Servile War, the success of your Spartacus adaptation hinges on whether you can do Marcus Licinius Crassus right.
Tell me frankly, if you were I, would you take the field against Spartacus? Of course. Why?
The role was famously played by Laurence Olivier in the 1960 film, who, his reputation for being a colossal tool aside, was one of the greatest actors of his generation, and very much a tough act to follow. Rather than going with a more recognisable name like John Hannah or Craig Parker, they went with a relative unknown in Simon Merrills, who afterwards I really feel should have changed his name to Simon Motherfucking Merrills. I don't think there will be any disagreement when I say that he is unbelievably incredible in this role.
I know you stand in considerable debt. Dangerous place for a man to find himself.
It is a hard thing to follow Olivier, and indeed the series' previous villains, especially John Hannah, but he was a Shakespearean actor himself, so he was more than up to the task.
A man's true enemy is doubt, the thing I would not carry into battle against Spartacus.
His performance is so good, I almost don't know how to describe it beyond variations of incoherent gushing. From the sheer presence that says, whenever this man is in the room, everyone else's opinion is irrelevant, to the way he plays Crassus and Kore's love story like it's the most epic romance in history. He can be utterly terrifying in, say, the decimation scene, very lovable in his intimate moments with Kore, and extremely pitiable, like when he finds out what a monster his son actually turned into.
Is this how I stand? Twisted and grotesque!
And while there is an intensity to him, it all feels extremely natural, and it's definitely not a show I can act performance like, say, Will Smith in King Richard. It's just a complete performance where he embodies the character from beginning to end. And since War of the Damned had to end with Spartacus and his army getting defeated, the season does essentially what Avengers Infinity War did with Thanos, and treats the story's villain as the protagonist. And since Infinity War is one of my favourite MCU films, I mean that as a sincere compliment.
Knowledge and patience. The only counter to greater skill.
Crassus is very different from the series' previous villains. Quintus and Lucretia were scheming social climbers who would use anyone to further their own goals. Glaber was an incompetent fool slowly driven mad trying to fix his own mess as it spiraled out of control. Tullius was just an elite dick who underestimated people. Marcus Crassus, on the other hand, is actually a man of honour, as demonstrated in his first episode, where he trains against a former gladiator to better understand how Spartacus thinks. and encourages him to use full force with the promise that he will earn his freedom if he wins the fight.
The coin I promised, had you bested me, shall be set towards monument.
The others underestimated Spartacus in their own ways, but Crassus respects him as an enemy from the beginning, and knows that the best way to defeat him is to figure out how his mind works. And he has a sly streak, such as setting things up for Spartacus to intercept a message and take out his competition so that he gets full command of the army, and pulling unorthodox tactics out of a hat in a way that really makes him feel like Spartacus's equal. I'm not a fan of the term anti-villain because it gets misused so much, but he's definitely a complex villain, and an extremely compelling one.
I do not pose question as master, but as a man, and would have answer as one.
He's legitimately in love with his slave, and treats her like a person, but then he also forces men to beat their comrades to death as punishment. And that's not out of sadism, but because everything he does is for political advancement, and he thinks that is how you command an army. He sells an innocent woman into slavery not out of cruelty, well, maybe a little, but because anyone who is known to help Spartacus has to be punished in case other Romans start getting ideas. And when he and Spartacus finally meet face to face, there is no hatred, just different ideologies, and attempted mutual respect from Crassus. And when they have their big duel towards the end, Crassus even says,
Would that you'd been born a Roman. And that stood beside me.
I gotta say, I love the end for this character too. Although he came close, he didn't get to fully defeat Spartacus, and as in real life, Pompey takes all the credit, which Crassus has to accept as the only way to secure his future.
Spartacus was defeated
in the north by valiant Pompey, hero of Hispania.
And even though he technically wins, there is no real victory, since he's lost his son and the woman he loves, and he'll go back to Rome to a wife he feels nothing for, who will end up becoming known for her affairs, including with Caesar himself. Yes, that actually happened.
She never did care for me.
And eventually dying via molten gold poured into his mouth.
Well, I think I speak for all of us. Ew.
It was a tricky job to find a way to end the season that couldn't see our villain defeated without completely contradicting history, so this hopeless and meaningless win did the trick nicely.
It is only in the days to come that a man may find solace. When memory fades.
My best friend Cody sometimes refers to War of the Damned as the Simon Merrill show, and that's a fair assessment. But how about whose show this actually was? So here we have Mr. Spartypants, and that's actually what Liam McIntyre named his Twitch channel. Vengeance had seen Spartacus finally take Glaber's life and balance the scales, so now with no more personal stakes, he just continues to liberate places like the mines and kill all the Romans who stand in his way. But now that his cause is no longer reactive, he has to face some other realities of war beyond his comrades falling in battle. Blood and Sand was about gathering his forces to rebel, and Vengeance uniting them under a common cause. But War of the Damned has him having to realize they may fight for the same army, but they don't all share the same ideology. Although they conquer Sinuessa for well-intentioned reasons, taking over a city is a lot different from liberating a prison, and the show isn't ignorant of the consequences, with the end of the massacre highlighting that an innocent mother and her child were killed, to our hero's obvious discomfort, and it becomes increasingly obvious that it won't just be Roman soldiers who die in this war. Spartacus does attempt to keep the survivors safe, but when you have monsters like Nemetes and deranged idiots like Naevia among your ranks, bad things still happen. And he gets this moment with Laeta, who hit a group of survivors to try and protect them.
Mercy, you robbed me of my husband. Your people slaughtered thousands within my city. And I now stand condemned for trying to save but a handful from such cruelty.
And Spartacus does not kill her, but rather spares her, and warns the rest of his forces about the penalty for harming the prisoners, with a pointed statement about how he won't become like the Romans.
And I will not see us become the very thing we fight against.
And the show doesn't ask us to sidestep this actions with, well, it's war, so what are you going to do? And outright highlights that while Spartacus himself may be noble and so is his cause, not everyone who fights for it is, and he still holds some responsibility. Laeta is presented as pretty justified in believing him the enemy until she gets a taste of just what the Romans are capable of. And Spartacus' storyline for the first half of the season is in grappling with the conflict that comes with having to do certain things when you're at war and trying not to be the very enemies you're fighting to overthrow. Like when he's first infiltrating Sinuessa and comes across a slave being stoned to death, and the others stop him from saving him because it'll blow their cover, so all he can do is give the man a mercy kill to end his suffering. or how Laeta's husband plans to burn all the city's grain, which will condemn everyone to death by starvation, so he kills him because he can't afford to risk innocent lives on him doing the right thing. Or how, after taking the city, he still leaves it open for slaves to flee to, even though that's what allows Caesar to sneak in. Spartacus has achieved his goals of getting revenge on Batiatus and Glaber, and he's got this army now and has to do something with it, so there are no personal stakes on his side beyond freeing other slaves and killing the Romans that try to stop them. But it's in these portions that he has to confront the fact that simply freeing slaves and killing their masters isn't without its own consequences, and he doesn't want to be the Glaber in someone else's story. And honestly, that's what he starts out as to Laeta. He killed her husband, took her home, and put her in chains. And this was a woman who vouched for him when he first came to Sinuessa, and it's this that further sows the seeds that lead to him and Crixus splitting. Since he doesn't want to risk innocent lives, while Crixus is like, who cares, let's kill people. And Spartacus has to apply his tactic of pulling a miracle solution out of the most unlikely place to his own army as well as the Romans, with a plan to release the prisoners into safety, but also to make the Romans think there's dissension in the ranks. It gets them out of Sinuessa mostly intact, but the difference in ideologies can't go unnoticed.
I will not march my people to the afterlife, and I will not die with a Roman sword in my back.
So Spartacus has to just let him and the people who agree with him go. He won't try to keep them in line with fear like the Romans do, so he lets them go and do what they want. Even his romance with Laeta does some interesting things for the character, as Laeta is often the one to remind him to be more humane, so as not to be as bad as the Romans, like when she vouches for Core.
Hell is fugitivus as many among you, regardless of which dominus she fled.
And Spartacus in turn helps her adjust to her new life and open her eyes to what Rome was capable of. And most of us are in agreement that this is the season where Liam McIntyre properly settles into the role and makes it his own.
It is all a free man can do.
It's extremely obvious when Spartacus and Crassus finally meet, and he's sharing the screen with a talent of Simon Merrill's level who became his character completely. Liam became Spartacus too, and it's a performance that's worthy of praise.
Let us teach them that all who draw breath are of equal worth.
He also understood the character enough to speak to the possible historical loophole that Spartacus's body was never recovered, leaving it open for a chance to have him survive the show. In his mind, Spartacus would never abandon the war. There was no other end for him in sight. He'd never say, I've liberated enough slaves and waltz off into the sunset. And by the finale, he's telling Gannicus what he's really fighting for.
But the life of Sibyl, of Laeta, the mother and her child, so many others, and I would see them live.
It's hard to really summarize just how powerful the series finale victory actually is. Yeah, it had a great battle that takes up 20 minutes of runtime, and wraps up all the main plot threads very neatly in a way I don't think many other shows have accomplished, but it's not just that it's a well-made hour of TV. Enough so that I'll probably do an anatomy of an episode on it one day. Like, there was a lot of discourse surrounding the Game of Thrones finale on how it would be impossible to please everyone, as if a finale would be considered bad just because X didn't happen or your favourite character didn't come out on top. But I think that's missing the wood for the trees. And I'll leave off the Game of Thrones bashing to highlight another highly controversial finale, which is that of the sitcom How I Met Your Mother.
No, I don't buy it.
The central premise of the series is Ted Mosby telling his teenagers the title story, with a twist in the first episode being that Robin Scherbatsky, a woman that Ted meets and prematurely declares his love for, is pointedly not the mother, and the first 3 seasons explore how and why Ted and Robin don't work as a couple, and they eventually set Robin up with the womanizing best friend Barney, and build several seasons towards the last one taking place at their wedding. And with a lot of pressure on this off-screen mother, the show miraculously did her justice by finally introducing her, and Kristen Milioti perfectly bringing her to life, so that her and Ted's actual meeting more than delivers in terms of payoff. But the twist in the finale is that the mother, Tracy, actually died years ago, and Ted is really looking for his kid's approval to date Robin. Now, this ending was pre-filmed during the first season, when Ted and Robin were portrayed as somewhat star-crossed lovers who didn't get the chance to be together by circumstance. The ending may have been more consistent with that, but the characters had evolved into different people over 9 seasons, and multiple storylines examining why Ted and Robin wouldn't work. And the mother was no longer a one-episode character we barely knew and had little connection to, but a main protagonist we'd spent a whole season getting attached to for the sake of a romantic payoff that seemed all but guaranteed by the narrative. So the ending wasn't disliked because it was sad, but because it felt narratively unsatisfying. Spartacus also has a sad ending that's only slightly bittersweet, since only 4 main characters survive. and two of them weren't exactly series mainstays, but it's organic to the way the story has been told since the beginning. This was a show where the characters could only survive the impossible for so long, and with this season in particular, there was an inevitability hanging over everything. Every decision that was made was the right one for the story and the characters. For example, Naevia was originally planned to survive, but the character had evolved too much from how Leslie Ann Brandt portrayed her that it would be unusual for her to walk off into the sunset without Crassus, and so it made more sense for her to die to be together with him. It would be grossly depressing to have Sibyl die, because she was the ray of hope and symbol of the innocence who Spartacus set free, and Laeta needed to survive for similar reasons. It wouldn't make sense for Agron and Naevia to lose each other again after they'd been reunited thanks to Naevia's most selfless moment of the season. Gannicus had spent the entire season discovering that he was in fact a hero, and so a hero's death was what was warranted. Plus, history, you know? We may have loved characters like Lugo and Saxa, but there was no way they weren't going out on the battlefield. And Spartacus himself? There was no other way for his story to go.
Do not shed tears.
Every story about Spartacus is a tragedy, because it was the real-life tale of an ordinary guy who managed to rally an estimated 70,000 to fight against the Roman Republic that ended with their forces being crushed and 6,000 people being crucified along the Appian Way because Marcus Crassus really wanted to flex. But there's power to be found in this story, since a band of slaves and gladiators managed to keep the Romans at bay for 2 whole years. And it's been theorized that the magnitude of the rebellion was so eye-opening that a good chunk of Romans started treating their slaves better out of fear. And eventually, the empire started implementing some legal changes that made things a little better for slaves. So the story of Spartacus is also a parable on the difference between actual victory and moral victory, whether it be the 1960 film where Spartacus and Antoninus fight to the death because they're each trying to spare a friend from a painful crucifixion, or the main characters we followed for 4 seasons in the series getting to die free, knowing that some innocent people got to live because they did the right thing. I always say there's a beauty to every tragedy, and it's that beauty that makes them so compelling, and sets them apart from stories that are simply bleak and nihilistic for the sake of realism. And sometimes I say that the Spartacus series is one of the best representations of a Shakespearean tragedy that isn't a direct adaptation, and it feels only fitting that after the absolutely perfect climax, with Joseph LaDuca's fantastic score and Dan Furigel breaking our hearts with the show's last line, we get a proper theatrical curtain call as the end credits salute most of the series' characters, ending with and I don't know what more I can say about the series, since I think this is my longest video yet, and I still had to leave loads of stuff out to potentially cover in other ones. But I think I'll paraphrase something Aurelia says in the finale to Blood and Sand that not only hit me really hard last year, but is just oh so appropriate. It was not a perfect series, but it was ours.
There is no greater victory than to fall from this world a free man.
I could go on and on, but I'm going to stop here. I can't think of a final sentence to properly finish off this video, but I guess that's telling of just how much Spartacus the series meant and means to me and millions more. So I guess I'll just say one more word, and that would be gratitude.